Well, thank you, Francis, for the introduction and the invitation. Thank you, Juan. I think the staff of the forum has been wonderful in setting up this meeting, and I'm really happy to be here. And I'm looking forward to our discussions over the next few days. No pressure going first, but I thought I'd kick it off and try to tell you something that about a child. So in the mid-2070s, when this child is about 50 years old, the world will be a very different place. I don't think that I could speculate about what kind of music she's going to listen to. I certainly couldn't tell you about her relationship with AI, but I think I can tell you something about her relationship with water, and it will be unrecognizable relative to the water system that we rely upon today. When this girl turns 50, there will be about 20% more people on Earth. The population will increase to about 10 billion people. And those people, the people who live in what today we consider low-income countries, will be living at a much higher standard of living. And as a result, they're going to be hungry for meat. And we estimate that by the 2070s, the world's farmers are going to have to raise about 70% more food on the same sort of land area that we have today, and oftentimes with irrigation technology. When this girl turns 50, we will have broken a lot of our reliance upon fossil fuels. But I think it's safe to say that in the process of weaning the world's economies off of fossil fuels, we will have bought into a lot of climate change and a lot more release of greenhouse gases. And so the average temperature of the planet will be about 2 degrees higher. And to put that into a local perspective, the climate of Spain will look like the climate of Northern Africa. The climate of the American Southwest will look like that of Northern Mexico. And many other places on Earth will have a climate that in many ways is undistinguishable from the climate we have today. Finally, I think we can say that this means that the water systems that this girl will experience will be quite different. The dams and reservoirs that her great-grandparents built will be receiving only a fraction of the flow that they receive today. So something is going to have to change. If we want her 50th birthday to be a time of celebration without a lot of anxiety about the water that she'll have, something has to be different. And I can think of 3 ways in which we're likely to do it. The first is to use water more efficiently. With existing technologies, with management strategies that people have already experimented with in different parts of the world, it should be possible to reduce the amount of water that we use in our homes, that we use on our farms, that we use in our factories by somewhere between 25 and 50%. The second strategy we can do is to rethink the existing infrastructure that we have. The dams, the reservoirs, the canals that we rely upon today can be operated in a different way, using things like managed aquifer recharge, forecast-informed reservoir operation, wetland restoration, better management of the forests that are on our catchments, to make sure that a larger fraction of the water that falls on the earth is available for human use. And that can make a big difference in the amount of water we have. And finally, the third approach that we can use is to tap into sources of water that we call unconventional water resources, water that without some form of advanced treatment would be undrinkable today. Now, the purpose of this forum, or one of the main purposes of the forum, is to talk about this third of these water resource options. Things like seawater desalination, brackish water desalination, and water recycling. Whether there are approaches, opportunities, unintended consequences, and paths to delivering them in our future. And to get us thinking about the way in which the actions we take today can improve the lives of people who live 4 or 5 decades from now, I want to take you back 4.5 decades to the roof of the White House, where President Jimmy Carter has just unveiled the solar panels that he believes are going to revolutionize the United States' energy system. President Carter thought that by making strategic investments in technologies like solar energy, we could get the country to a place where it would no longer be reliant upon foreign sources of oil. He thought that the government had a role to play in this. Well, a little more than a year after this picture was taken, when President Reagan took over, these solar panels were pulled off the roof of the White House because President Reagan thought the market could take care of the nation's energy needs. In the 45 years since this picture was taken, solar energy has come a long way. The cost of installed solar has dropped by about 2 orders of magnitude. Now, some of that was a result of U.S. government investments. Some of it was a result of investments by governments in other parts of the world. Some of it was a result of work by private companies and foundations to improve solar energy. And some of it was the impact of Wright's Law. Now, Wright's Law is a way that we describe the idea that as a technology advances, the process of learning by doing and economies of scale drives down the costs of new technologies. And I think the idea of Wright's Law is particularly profound when we talk at the forum about the future of water technologies. Ideas that we'll talk about over the next couple of days that might seem a little bit far-fetched actually start to become reasonable if we choose the right ones, if we make investments in technologies, and we take advantage of the ability of Wright's Law to drop the costs of things that might seem a little far-fetched at first. And the most obvious connection between solar panels and Wright's Law and water scarcity is seawater desalination. If we look around the world today, we can see that about 1% of the world's population gets their drinking water from seawater desalination. You can see it's mainly in the Middle East, it's in Northern Africa, it's in isolated parts of the world where people are wealthy enough to afford seawater desalination plants and can take advantage of the economies of scale that come from large treatment plant operation. I think in many parts of the world, it's the next least expensive water technology, and it's reliable, but it's not without its naysayers. In parts of the world where there's a strong desire to take care of the environment, like in California, large proposed seawater desalination plants have recently been rejected by members of the public. The fact that seawater desalination plants are often built by private companies and not by public agencies has led people to be suspicious of the motives of the people building desalination plants. And as a result of these two forces, concerns about the environment, concerns about who controls water, people in places like Melbourne and Sydney, which built seawater desalination plants at the height of a severe drought, have had second questions about the technology. So what I hope we can discuss at this meeting is the way in which future development of seawater desalination might be able to drop the costs and make this technology available to people in low and middle income countries, the potential environmental impacts of seawater desalination, and the issue of social acceptance. The other big technology that I think will be a topic of discussion over the next couple of days is water reuse. The idea of taking the water that comes out of sewage treatment plants, subjecting it to additional treatment, and using it for a variety of uses, including drinking water. And if you want to see the power of water recycling, the best place to look, in my opinion, is to California, which is one of the leaders in this process of water recycling. And what I'm showing you here is a graph of the amount of water that's recycled in California projected out to the year 2040 by location. And I want to point out the way in which water recycling has developed in California. First, we have a period prior to the 1970s when most recycled water was used for agriculture and landscaping in cities. Then, and this happened like in California's Central Valley and a few of the large cities. And then we have a period between about 1990 and 2010 where a group of pioneering utilities in Southern California demonstrated that indirect potable reuse, this idea of putting wastewater through reverse osmosis membrane, subjecting it to advanced treatment, and putting it into an aquifer was safe and cost-effective. And that caused a process of legitimization to happen where the public accepted this as an appropriate technology. And then during a drought that happened about 10 years ago, the rest of the state agreed upon this. And now the big cities like Los Angeles and San Diego have committed to finishing the job of water recycling to get us to a point where about 2/3 of the wastewater in California will be recycled by the year 2040, meaning that in parts of the state, close to 40% of the water supply will come from water recycling. We can see similar trends happening in places like Singapore and in Windhoek in Namibia. We can see this idea of water recycling in cities spreading to places like Phoenix and Denver and Atlanta in the United States. And when we look to Europe, we can see places like Berlin and Amsterdam and Barcelona recycling a lot of wastewater, but not talking about it. And the reason that they don't talk about it is a belief that the public will not accept it as socially, so the social rejection of the technology. So at this meeting, I hope we can talk about this idea of water recycling, especially for potable purposes, because it turns out to be very cost-effective and safe, and the way in which it might expand in the future. But I want to extend the discussion of water recycling beyond this idea of taking the water that comes into sewage treatment plants and recycling it. I want to think about water recycling at the scale of individual buildings. If you look around the world to cities like Tokyo and New York, you can see a movement towards recycling water at the individual building scale. And this has been driven by a desire for resilience in response to natural hazards, and also the idea of making cities more sustainable. Scores of engineers and architects are captivated by the idea of capturing the nutrients in the urine coming out of people's toilets, taking the solid waste coming from their toilets and turning it into biogas and making a circular economy. And that's a wonderful idea, but I think it becomes even more powerful when we realize that if we recycle the water at an individual building scale, we greatly expand our water resources. So we recently conducted a so-called techno-economic analysis where we look at the projected costs of technologies for taking all of the water in a building and coupling this with rainwater capture and providing net zero water buildings, buildings that don't require a connection to a centralized water source. And we found that this is already economically competitive with existing systems. It has a return on investment of less than 10 years in North America and Western Europe. And so this is a technology for the future. I think this is also quite interesting because it has the potential to have impacts far beyond wealthy countries that can afford to kind of experiment in the early stages of a new technology, with the idea of rights law driving down prices as technologies develop further. We could imagine a case where these technologies spread to low and middle income countries. For example, today in Bangalore, when new buildings are built, there's a requirement from the government that they have to have the capability of recycling water within the building. And if this idea takes off, I can imagine it spreading to sub-Saharan Africa, where 15 of the fastest growing cities of the world currently exist, and where governments chronically underfund water infrastructure. So you could imagine a leapfrog technology where people take a new approach to developing their water resources. The other important implication of this ability to recycle water at the building scale is to look to our rural communities. We heard Francis talk a little while ago about rural communities like America's native reservations, and many people live in the countryside who don't have access to water. In my home state of California, close to 100,000 people lack access to safe water and an adequate supply of water, partly as a result of pollution of their water supply from the intensive agricultural operations going on in the land, and partly due to the fact that a lot of our farms have overpumped groundwater during times of drought. The state has already dedicated several $billions to an idea called consolidation, basically taking water from the small cities that are near these agricultural communities and extending it to individual households in the countryside. But that only works if you live within a few kilometers of a big city, a small city. If you live in the rural countryside, You obtain water from a rainwater tank, a plastic tank, like many people in the world do. You get a delivery from a truck and you work your way through this water tank till all of the water is exhausted. And that is hard to believe for one of the wealthiest countries in the world, that we have 100,000 people in California and many more throughout the country on this technology. But the kinds of technologies I described for recycling water at the building scale, as they scale up, as they become more reliable, as they become easier to operate, I can imagine them having an impact here and many other parts of the world. Now, no discussion of water systems would be complete without a discussion of agriculture. About 80% of the water that humanity takes out of the environment is used for agriculture, much of that for irrigation. The dead zones that we'll hear about in the oceans, much of the pollution, the toxic algal blooms, and all of these other kinds of things that we see as happening in our coastlines are largely attributable to the way in which we use water in agriculture. We also have this challenge that as the climate change and as we have to grow more food, we have to make our water go further. Now, we'll probably get to this goal of growing more food largely through agronomic advances, whether that's plant breeding, whether that's selection of better crops, but some of it will occur through the phase out of surface irrigation or flood irrigation and its replacements with sprinklers and micro-drip irrigation. But there are also opportunities for these unconventional water sources to provide a means of agricultural irrigation. In places like Israel, we see the wastewater being reused for agriculture, and that makes sense in a certain number of places, but the quantity of water that we need to grow food and the distance between our big cities and our farms means that that's probably not a solution. Likewise, seawater desalination is largely out of reach of the agriculture that we need to grow food for people, but it will become less expensive in the future. In my opinion, one of the greatest opportunities for unconventional water sources to contribute to agriculture is this idea of taking brackish groundwater. The world has large reserves of brackish groundwater. Much of it is inland, much of it is underneath the farms where we grow our food, and it doesn't need a lot of desalination to make it adequately available for farming. The challenge here is that when we desalinate water far from the ocean, we're left with a brine, and that brine is difficult to manage. It's not a simple case of just evaporating it in the desert sun. It has to be managed or it's going to contaminate the water supply. So, in conclusion, I want to remind you before we begin of the reason we're here. We're here to meet new people. We're here to learn about new developments and technologies. We're here to network and to celebrate the accomplishments of people working in the water field. But what we're really here for is to think about what we do today and the way it creates a path for people living in a future generation to have a future where the water supply is safe and secure, and where our oceans and our fresh waters are protected through the actions of people that they never met who lived 4 or 5 decades ago. I look forward to the meeting and look forward to our discussions. Thank you.